Let's open up the Black Series Archive 6-inch scale figure of the 501st Legion Clone Trooper. Varykino. If it's Star Wars, we collect it. Hello there, thanks for visiting Varykino. One of my big goals this year is to open up all of my Star Wars figures that I bought with the intention to open up, but when I got them home from the store, I tucked them away for later and just never got around to it. So I've been having so much fun really going through and opening up all of my 3.75-inch and 6-inch figures. Now, one of the lines that I really like opening up are the archive ones. The front bubble takes up a lot of space. Once I open them up, I'm left with the backing card to keep and a really cool figure to display. I recently opened up Clone Commander Cody from Episode 3, and of course you can see that I have another Episode 3 Clone Trooper, the 501st Legion Clone Trooper. I think it's really important to have these ones out of their packaging, considering we're getting really close to the 20th anniversary of Episode 3 this year, so of course I really want to get this one out. So important for Order 66. Now, of course, Hasbro has announced a reissue of this figure with updated articulation and paintwork and a head underneath the helmet. So of course I do want to get that one as well. So I really do need to get on and open this one up so I can have them side by side when I eventually add that one to my collection. This is going to be so much fun. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Coming up really soon, I'll take a closer look at this archive figure. I'll take a closer look at the older articulation and the accessories. But first, let's take a quick look at the packaging. While the Black Series line of 6-inch Star Wars figures typically uses boxes for their packaging, the archive line of reissued figures uses a backing card and bubble packaging style instead. We have a rectangular backing card with a black background, of course very fitting for the Black Series. We have the Star Wars of the Black Series logo here in the top right. We have a cutout for the hanger, and for this particular figure it is part of the 50 Lucasfilm collection, so we have that gold logo here in the top left as well. The archive line has this fun angular cutout along that left edge, which is echoed with a bit of a cut-off corner for the front bubble here as well. That color of the 50 Lucasfilm collection is used also for the character name down the left side. It has a bit of a gold tone to it, 501st Legion Clone Trooper. Now behind the figure itself we have a light grey panel which really helps the details stand out rather than a black background, and of course that extends over to the right hand side where we can see the archive line title there as well. We've got a nice bubble here showing the figure and the one blaster accessory. Inside the bubble we have a small card insert with artwork of the 501st Legion Clone Trooper, which looks really nice. You can see it also includes the warning and the age number there as well. Moving on to the back of the backing card, we have that same insert artwork from the front here again on the back of the card, a little bit larger. It looks really nice. We have the Star Wars the Black Series logo, and again the name for this figure, 501st Legion Clone Trooper, in that gold color for the 50 Lucasfilm collection. We also have a short blurb about the Clone Trooper. An elite unit of Clone Troopers, the 501st Legion patrolled the grounds after their siege of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. So a little bit of a description there. Doesn't go into too many spoilers about Order 66. Now again, because this is part of the 50 Lucasfilm collection, we have this fun timeline showing the releases of films and animated series of the 50 years of Lucasfilm, with the formation of Lucasfilm in 1971 all the way through to 2021 when this collection was released. Now I think it's interesting because I always think of the 501st Legion Clone Trooper as being from Episode 3, but if you can see here, it is actually noted as being highlighted from the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels rather than the live action prequel films, which are down here. I think that that's rather interesting. There is a short blurb about the 50 Lucasfilm collection here as well. Commemorate the first 50 years of Lucasfilm with figures inspired by the Star Wars animated series. You can see there it mentions animated series rather than the prequel films. I think that's just an interesting note. The rest of the packaging is barcode, copyright, all of that kind of stuff. I think it looks pretty cool, but he's been in his packaging for far too long. I really want to get him out and test out all of the poses. So now I have the 501st Legion Clone Trooper figure out of the packaging finally, as well as the included blaster accessories, so we can get stuck in and check out all of the details. As usual, I'm going to take a closer look at the sculpting and paint job first, and then we'll go into articulation, the accessory, and some 501st final poses. So I just think this looks so cool out of the packaging. I started collecting Star Wars stuff around the prequel era, so I'm very nostalgic about Clone Troopers, and I'm so excited to see this one. Still looks white even after a few years. When I think back to some of my 3.75 inch figures that came around the prequel era, they are so very yellow. It's a little bit sad to see. I'm hoping the modern figures are a little bit better when it comes to keeping their bright white armor, because he just looks so cool. I love that iconic blue. When it comes to Clone Troopers from episode 3, I like to think that the 501st Clone Trooper are perhaps one of the most iconic, probably maybe tied for Cody there as well. Of course, I'd probably say Captain Rex if he was actually in episode 3. He's probably the most famous Clone Trooper now, but I love the blue on this one. But of course, I do have to preface this by saying this one is an older figure, of course, from the archive line. They don't change any of the original sculpting. Sometimes the archive line does use modern printing technology if the older ones were not done with the photorealistic printing, but this one, it does still have that older articulation. So you can see the pegs here on the legs and the arm. Unfortunately, it does cut through the paintwork, but we'll get to that in a minute. So of course, in saying that, talking about the digital printing, it's really uniform. If you look at pictures of these figures online, they have exactly the same weathering. It's not hand done. It's all uniform, looking exactly the same. So if you want to army build them, they might look a little bit odd because the, scratches and the dirt are going to look identical all lined up. You'd probably have to go in and do a little bit of, fan work there, sort of add a little bit of variance yourself. But of course, it does mean that the paintwork is very fine. You do get a really much sort of finer hand compared to the sort of the mass-produced older techniques. But of course, digital printing doesn't mean that we're not going to get any tiny little paint flaws. There are just a tiny little few marks on this one, but I'll go over that. So let's start off with the helmet. Of course, we have the Phase 2 Clone Trooper helmet, so iconic. And there are some really cool paintwork details here. Of course, we've got a base white, we've got a black brow trim there, the black visor, we've got the gray and black grille, we've got gray and I think that's silver there for the chin details there. Going along the back, we've got blue stripes on the sort of cheek tubes here. We've got a gray panel coming around the back. We've got a small little gray detail here on the back, and those same side details are repeated here on the other side. And of course, the iconic blue paintwork starting out at the chin and kind of creating a triangular formation across the top of the helmet over towards the back and ending at that gray panel there. So iconic. Now we've got a lot of weathering on this particular helmet. We see it predominantly around the cheek tubes here. We've got a little bit across the top and a little bit on that top crest here as well. So on my one, there is like this tiny little squiggle, I want to call it. And I don't know if that's actually part of the printing because it does look a little bit different. Often when you look at the sort of digital printing weathering, you can see the tiny little dots in the printing that you can sort of see when you're looking at it really close up, or if you take a picture and sort of blow it up, you can see the dots there. There is a tiny little bit of the blue that has been printed on the crest here. Just a few dots that I can see when I'm looking up very close. And I've got a little bit here where it's kind of gotten a little bit darker, where we've got a little bit of ink kind of clumping together here. Very minor. And of course, if this was a really stark, clean figure, you would really notice any tiny little inconsistencies with paintwork, but because he's weathered, all of that's kind of disappearing. In fact, I didn't really see any of that when I'm, first getting him out of the box, taking a closer look. It's only when I'm really looking up close that I start to notice those tiny things. So it's not something I'm ever really going to notice once I've got this one on display. But yeah, I do like the weathering on this one. I know weathering can be sort of a slightly controversial topic when it comes to Star Wars figures. Some people don't mind it. Some people always think it's too heavy, too light. Very different opinions. I am never quite brave enough to go in and sort of do any kind of weathering, airbrushing, any kind of stuff like that to figures or vehicles that I've bought myself. How they come out of the box is how I'm going to keep them. And personally, I don't mind this one. What I do find a little bit quirky is that almost always Hasbro never, and I say never, but almost always, put weathering on the back of the legs of figures. It's something I've really noticed recently. We do actually have just a little bit bit of withering on the back of the figure. We can see here there is some withering just under the back of the box here on the back chest plate there, and a little bit on the back of the biceps. We've got a little bit here, a little bit there, and just there. So interestingly, it seems to be holding true my suspicions that there is no withering down the back of the legs. So they look very clean and shiny, but when we get to the front of the legs, they look very muddy, especially this section here, very grimy. Now, of course, we don't necessarily see mud a lot on Coruscant, where I think of these guys being predominantly seen on screen. So yeah, it's up to each fan, I guess, whether you think that this is like over-weathered, under-weathered, but I'm perfectly fine with this. It looks okay to me. It actually looks kind of like muddy, like it's dirty, and I think that that's kind of fun. It's not till I look up really, really fine that I can start to see the dots, and sometimes you can kind of see where it cuts off. There's a little bit of sort of a clean line here where it kind of fades and then stops a little bit abruptly here, where this would be sort of the inner part of the thigh. It's kind of crossing a midline where the withering just kind of stops. It's a little bit more noticeable on this particular section there. You can kind of see where it's not going to pass, and we don't really see the withering crossing over the painted stripes here on the side as well. It's just kind of contained in this front zone, which is perhaps a little unrealistic, but to be honest, I almost always pose my figures facing forward, so I'm not too bothered by the fact that there is no withering on the back. I'm never going to be posing my figures like this, but that's just my perspective. I know for me personally, I'm really trying hard not to army build in the 6-inch scale. I've already gone down that rabbit hole in the 3.75-inch line. I'm trying very hard not to do it in the 6-inch line. So all of my Black Series figures are posed facing forward. I'm not building scenes where I might see them from the back. So if this was in the 3.75-inch scale, I'd be a lot more bothered by the lack of withering from the back, because I'm going to be posing them in all different scenes. But for my Black Series, they're predominantly facing forward there. So not too bothered. There is a little bit of withering on the back. And of course, if you're charging into battle, you are going to get a little bit more withered across the front. So in that case, it's a little bit believable. I do quite like the sort of the scratching through the blue paint. I think this is quite interesting. Of course, we're very familiar with the weathering sort of making things look like they're sort of splashed on top of the armor. I quite like the way that they've done the scratches and kind of the weathering on these shoulder pieces, sort of carving through the blue paint. Looking up really close, once again, you can see that this is digital printing. It has those telltale little tiny dots, but it honestly looks like something's scratched the figure, which is really quite fun. Especially here, it kind of reminds me of, childhood toys where they got scratched across, the driveway, across concrete, or just, rough and tumble play. It does look like something's scratched the front of the armor, which is really quite nice. And we do have a little bit of withering down the front of the blue detail here on the chest. I love how crisp the lines are for the blue paint. It's just nice and clean, nice and uniform. And we've got a little bit here at the wrists. On this one here, of course, we've got the chest detail. Those shoulder pieces are completely blue. We've got a blue panel here on the back, which is quite nice. We've got some inlaid detail there of different colors. It looks like that's sort of a mid-gray in those recessed details, which is really nice. And we have a little bit of a blue stripe on the knee plates. Have to say, the printing on this one looks very symmetrical. This one is just a tiny bit off. We've got a little bit more blue paint on this side compared to this side. We've got a little bit of a thinner stripe along the inner edge compared to the wider one there. I feel like the printing is just a little bit misaligned on this one. Like I mentioned earlier, just because it's digital doesn't mean that we don't have some imperfections from time to time, but we do have a really nice example on this one. And we do have those blue stripes down the legs there. Really nice and straight. Very hard to do that by hand. So very nice to see that that is nice and straight on both sides. I just really like that blue and white. There is like a tiny bit of, I think this is scratching down here. There's just two little tiny white sort of scratches in the paint. I don't think that is actually sort of white weathering it down there by the ankle. I think that is just unfortunately a tiny scratch through the blue paint. That's, that's going to be the risk of these sort of layers here, but it is so minor, so tiny right down there. And of course, he is clearly battle worn. A tiny scratch is not really going to bother me, especially since we've got scratches here in that chest blue there. Overall, I really like like the painting on this figure. I like the blue color, I like the weathering, and everything looks clean. It's just mainly this knee plate here. Now, I wasn't able to get this one when it was originally released. I had to track it down later, so I wasn't able to see, you know, a few of these on this toy store shelf and pick the one I liked the best. This was the one that I was able to grab. And so, of course, it does have that slightly asymmetrical printing there on the knee plate. But again, I'm probably not really going to notice that once I get it on display and looking really cool amongst my other Black Series figures. So overall, of course, the rest of the Clone Trooper is just that plain white plastic. We do have, obviously, the black undersuit in places. It's kind of an interesting mix. In some places, it's, you know, black plastic with white paint. In other places it's white plastic with black paint. Now the painted sections, it looks like the elbow pads here in the back just have that kind of telltale gloss to them that kind of look painted. That's a different gloss to the gloss of plastic. So to my eye, because we've got sort of undersuit, I believe that Hasbro has used black plastic for this component here. So this elbow piece here is painted white. So I will be a little bit careful. You can kind of see where it's just not like the sort of ridge of the plastic, the black plastic underneath is a little bit higher. So it's not getting quite as full coverage of the paint. So there's like a little bit of a darker shadow to those sort of ridges there in the back. And it's looking like maybe, I can't quite tell, maybe the knee, if we're following the same kind of theory, just because of the way it kind of looks in here. I think this is all one piece. So the knee plate would be painted white, but we do have these little gray stripes on the back that are covering that up nicely. And of course, we've got blue and printing here on the front. So I think that's all disguising it. Just again, that sort of gloss. But I have to say, if this is white paint, and I think it is, it's got a really good coverage. It's not, I'm not getting shadows through it of the black plastic there at all. So that's really nice to see. I have noticed that on one or two other figures where the sort of the white sort of armor paint hasn't quite completely covered the black, so you kind of get a little bit of an echo of that darker under sort of color coming through. But he looks really nice and white, and you have to really look up close to see the differences between white plastic and white painted black plastic, which is always really, it's kind of important. I want my Clone Troopers to look uniformly white, sort of the in-world armor. I want it to all look like it's all made out of the same stuff. It looks like we have a slightly different plastic used for the belt, probably because belts are often used in sort of a flexible plastic, sort of pulled tight around the body. It's giving sort of that slightly flexible rubbery plastic. Just in terms of the look, it actually feels quite sharp in terms of the detail, which is nice, but just has that kind of look to it that's slightly different than the shiny, harder plastic used on the armor pieces around it, which makes sense. We've got some really nice detail there. No painted detail on this particular Clone Trooper belt, but that fits. Looks really nice. He is a little bit clean on this lower torso section though. We've just got the sculpting lines and no painted details or anything, no weathering on this section here. But overall, I'm really impressed with the white. The other section that is often painted white, and we see this a bit on Stormtroopers as well, is because the hands are black. So that means the armor plates on the back of the hands are painted. But once again, really good coverage. I think there is maybe like a speck that's like a little scratch on this one, but very, very minimal. And again, it kind of gets lost in the overall weathering of this figure. I really like how white that looks, especially right next to the white forearm armor there. Looking really good. Nice crisp paint lines as well. I'm not seeing sort of a bleeding of paint sort of going over. Oh, on the cross section here, you can kind of see the black of the plastic because the paint hasn't sort of wrapped around that wider edge of the armor piece. So you can sort of see that. It's always a little bit hard sometimes to show the details of black plastic components. It just looks like sort of disappears on camera. Looking underneath the helmet, we can see the sculpting of the sort of the ribbed undersuit that Clone Troopers wear. It's a little bit hard to see, black, and we can see that same sort of ribbed detail here at the top of the thighs. It's a little more minimal around the shoulders. It looks a little more flat there, but these are places where we do get a lot of movement, so I can understand why Hasbro would kind of tone down the sort of texture there, so it's not really sort of grinding as we start to move the arms around. But you can see the texture sculpted into the black plastic here on the back there there as well. Again, a little bit lost at the joints, particularly around the elbows and the back of the knees, because it's eaten up by the older articulation style. So we're not really getting sculpted legs in the back here. It's all basically articulation points there. So I'm really glad that Hasbro doesn't use this articulation style for their modern figures. It does give us, mostly on most figures, a really great range of motion. But of course, for the prequels, episode 2 and episode 3, the clone troopers were CGI. Even when they had human performers on set, like Temuera Morrison, most of the time they were wearing like a blue screen suit and the armor was computer generated over the top, which means that the armor is not really designed to really exist well in physical form. The articulation is really tight. There is not a lot of empty space between the armor plates, so if you try and move in it, you are quite restricted, and unfortunately that does translate into action figures as well. There is not a lot of space between the top of the thigh armor and the hip joints around here, so even though we do have these sort of super articulated joints that can sort of get really extreme angles, we are very much limited by the clone trooper armor, which is a little bit unfortunate. So for me personally, I do very much prefer the modern style, which does tend to favor design and accuracy over articulation. Not to say that they're not well articulated, but we don't have these pegs in there. We get a little bit more sort of human leg sculpting, especially in the arms. So I'm kind of glad, because even though we've got these high articulation styles on these older figures, we're just limited so much. So I'm really happy with the paintwork on this one, especially, you know, things like the back of figures. You just can't see. Even when you do get to see them in stores, you just can't see the back of the figures in the packaging. So it's always a bit of a relief when you get them out. Everything looks great, because I try not to spend ages in the store, you know, really micro-analyzing the paintwork and the detail of figures before I buy them. I give them, you know, a pretty good look over. But of course, with the modern era where we're having to source a lot of these figures online, you just never know. So I'm really happy with the way this figure looks. I'm just really taken aback by how cool this weathering on the blue shoulder bells looks. It just looks scratched, and I think that that's really fun. And of course, that means that you can play with these figures if you really want, take them outside, do some cool photography with them, and you're less sort of precious about these sort of heavily weathered figures, because it's just going to get lost in amongst there anyway. I am very careful with my toys. I'm not clever enough to do those awesome sort of realistic toy photography shots, but if you're going to take a figure outside into the real world to do some cool photos, I think he'd be a perfect one that you don't need to be too worried about. So let's test out the articulation, because I had some interesting sort of points to talk about with the Clone Commander Cody figure. But of course, he has things like that antenna off the shoulder. He does have some unique armor pieces. So I'm going to see if I'm going to run into the same sort of articulation points on this particular figure as well. So of course, this particular older clone trooper does not have a head under the helmet there, and as you can see, there's almost like a ridge around the bottom of it, so it's not going to have the same articulation as the sort of the modern version that's coming out soon that has a human head underneath a helmet. So I get the feeling this one's going to be a little bit restricted just looking at the base of this helmet. Am I really going to get that much? It's very tight side to side. We're kind of hitting the tubes here on the shoulders, and we get a little bit up and down, not a lot, but it's kind of locking up at this point, and I can get it kind of looking down there. So not a huge amount, but okay. About what I would kind of, at the minimum that I would hope. So let's test out the shoulders. I don't know, just having a quick little sort of squeeze of the shoulders. I don't think these are rubbery shoulders, which sometimes helps, because sometimes they will sort of bend on themselves when they hit the shoulder strap here of the chest armor. This is hitting at that point. That's not very high at all. And I can't, it's not bending like it's sort of the rubbery plastic. It's literally just hitting there. So that's as high as I'm getting in terms of raising the arm up to the side. Usually I can get more to sort of a complete straight across with the arms. both of those arms are hitting at that point, because this is not rubbery. I'm not bending it. Sometimes it looks a little bit wonky when they're sort of made of that sort of flexible plastic and you can kind of get a ripple, but it means that you can actually get the arms up. So of course, if you're going to want to raise the arms, you've kind of got to do it more by turning it and getting them all the way up like that. So it's very tight to the helmet. You can get them quite straight up, which is, I guess, useful. Sometimes when you try and move the arms up on these figures, they end up kind of creating a bit of a Y shape because they just don't want to get that close to the head. This one I can get fairly close. This one's going a little bit bendy because I'm moving it at the articulation spot. We have got a upper arm swivel just while I'm grabbing the arms around that's hidden underneath that bicep armor. Let's get him back down into a little bit more of a believable position just to show that bicep armor. So it's hidden underneath, which I really love. There's something about some of the armor styles in Star Wars works so well for hiding articulation points. And for this particular figure, we've got a swivel hidden underneath here, and there is one under the thigh piece, which we'll get to shortly as well. So we can swivel it. It's actually moving quite nicely. It's not stiff there. And on the other side, let's test out the elbow because we've got that 2-point articulation. But this is what I found on Cody. Normally with the 2 pegs, you could get the hand almost folded up quite high up to the shoulder because you can get that sort of really deep bend in with the arm. But on Clone Troopers, we have this inner arm strap from the elbow armor, and it's completely hitting against this armor piece and this armor piece. So that is as tight as I'm going to get for that elbow. So this is completely wasted articulation. I'd much rather have the modern style there because I'm just not even able to utilize this. And as you can see, we've got black pegs because it's closer to the black undersuit than the white armor, but it is cutting in. Now, sometimes, you know, you can kind of hide things a little bit with the black pegs and it kind of gets lost in the undersuit, but they just cut in to the sculpting of the armor. That isn't just, it's just not there on the actual, you know, in the movie. They don't have these big black circles cutting into the armor. So that is a real shame. And it does limit how high you can kind of raise the arm for doing sort of poses. You know, are they answering a holocom or, you know, firing blasters? I can move the arm at the shoulder to get it up higher, but I can't tighten this angle, which is, you know, frustrating. But that is just the restrictions of the Clone Trooper armor, as I was talking about earlier. They didn't really design the armor to be worn as physical armor by real people. Oh, the other little sculpting detail I forgot to notice, it's got the little sort of comlink style sculpting on this particular arm. It doesn't have any kind of lights or painting detail to it there, but that's nice. For this hand, we've got the extended trigger finger, which is separate. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to get a reasonable sort of a blaster pose. You can kind of see how I'm going to line up those hands. The hands will swivel nicely, but this one has side-to-side rocker. We can see there, so I'll be able to sort of rock the hand side to side. Sometimes the hand plates here on the back of the hands really limit. This one's not too bad. I can actually get it to a reasonable side position, and it's holding steady, which is good. Now this hand, just checking. I think is this one a front and back? It's very tight. I believe it's also black. Okay, so this one is more of this angle. So that one's very tight, but I can. So it's kind of neutral, straight there. I can move it inward. So a little bit of maneuverability there. Hopefully that might just give us a little bit more movability for holding his blaster accessory, because I'm not really able to do much with those elbows. So I'm hoping I can get it sort of a low blaster pose there. I'm not going to get it sort of posed up high against the chest. Moving those arms out of the way, we've got the mid-torso articulation point here. So he's got a little bit forward and back, actually pretty reasonable forward. Got his arms bent in a bit of an odd position now. So, but as you can see, the chest, the boxes here are hitting the chest corners here. So as soon as he hits there, those angles there of his chest plate are hitting the top of his belt boxes, which is unfortunate. He can lean back, you can kind of see the gap there underneath, but he can't really lean forward. It's exposing a little bit here in the back. more than I was expecting, to be honest, because I know how tight this section here is on a lot of figures. He does rock, and he does actually hold the position. He's not kind of snapping back, but he does have that kind of clicky rotation. He kind of clicks into a point and I can hear it in person. So of course, if you sort of move over these parts, so you sort of align them in between, you can kind of get a little bit of a deeper lean, but it starts to look odd when you go really round to the side, because you know that if you're wearing this much armor, you're just not twisting around quite that hard. It does limit maneuverability. So that's actually better than I was expecting, to be honest. So that's actually pretty good. A little bit of side to side wiggle there as well. And he's actually holding that position. He's not snapping back. It really bothers me when figures really feel like they're fighting you when I'm trying to put them into a pose and they just keep wanting to go back to neutral. So at least he is actually holding his poses. I don't think Hasbro could really give us much more in terms of sort of range of motion, particularly with so much armor around this. They would really have to start distorting the accuracy of the armor that is here. So I'm quite happy with that. Now, the legs, these are always tricky. So if I try and move the legs up, he's going to be tight out of the packaging. You can kind of see the high point on the armor, the thigh armor here. So if I'm going to move the leg, I'm going to rotate it, it's going to hit. Now this one is actually really tight. I'm just trying to get a good view on where the articulation point is. So of course I can swivel the thighs, so you can kind of swivel that high point so that it passes over. So if we're going to move the legs up, oh gosh, he's really fighting me. This is a really tight figure. And I don't want to break him. I do like testing out the articulation of my figures, but sometimes they just, I don't like feeling stressed out by my figures. And this one is really fighting me in terms of the articulation. But I'm kind of feeling like I'm forcing it, but you can see that that would hit. So we're not going to really get the legs much there in the side. You have to kind of pull that to the side and then you can kind of kick up to the front. Oh, there we go. Got a click. So you can see that that is probably about as high as I'm really going to get. Can go a little bit higher, but this guy is a little bit tight. So there, I'm now getting the armor hitting kind of in here. So that's about as high as I'm going to get, but I've had to swivel his thigh around so that that high point on the armor is passing sort of beside his hip rather than directly in the front. So he kind of has to rotate his leg a little bit out to get that pose, but that's how you get it if you want him to kick up. The figure on mine is very tight. I don't know that I'm gonna stress the other leg to see if I can get it on the same side. It's really fighting me. But at least I can sort of demonstrate a little bit. Yeah, I'm not sure how well he's going to go out to the sides on this figure. Okay, he's a little bit better going out to the side. I can sort of get him like that, but I don't really have like a beast or a speeder bike or anything to put this guy on, so I don't really need him to get into a wide-legged pose. And I'll just give you an example of the leg articulation, because it does again cut right through. You can see while we have black pegs for the articulation for the arms, for the legs we have white pegs, and for the most part that does make sense because it is cutting through completely in the armor on this exterior, but it is also breaking completely through those blue lines, so it does really stand out. If this was white, plain white armor, I think those pegs would blend in a little bit better, but they're cutting through some of the iconic blue printing for this figure. Now on the inside leg, those are the bigger sort of side ends to the pegs. Now for this one, on the upper thigh piece, it is completely within the white, so it's doing a pretty good job of hiding. Here it is completely cutting through the top of the calf armor into the black of the undersuit. So unfortunately that one is kind of doing what we have up here, where it's really cutting into the armor. So unfortunately it is very distracting. And because you can see we're getting the same thing like the elbows, the strap for the knee armor is completely creating this obstruction between these two pieces. So I can't bring the ankle up closer to the body like I can on other older figures that have this articulation style. So having these two pegs are sort of ruining the paint and the detail here for no great advantage in terms of the actual angle of moving there. It's just such a shame, and I'm so glad that this iconic clone trooper is getting a refurb with this newer version that is coming out. Of course, I don't get rid of my older figures just because along the line we get an upgrade. I still have, you know, Kenner figures, Power of the Force 2 figures, because they're kind of, you know, part of the journey of both my collecting story and of Star Wars toys in general. So it's still fun to see these figures, you know, but of course it's fun to see Hasbro actively improving on what they can do for figures. So of course I like this figure. I think he's cool. I've never been a big fan of this particular articulation style, but I'm glad that they have chosen to kind of, you know, give it another go and are doing a cool new version. But as I said earlier, I'm really trying not to army build my figures. So of course I was really controlled. I didn't want to buy 2 or more of this figure, even though I think the 501st Legion Trooper is one of those ones where you really want to build multiples of them. Clone Commander Cody, you really only need 1. He's not seen, you know, multiple times in the same scene, but the 501st Legion marching the steps with Anakin, I think they look cool if you have multiples. So I'm kind of glad that they've re-released, or soon to be releasing, a new version so I can have 2 without kind of breaking my personal rule of not army building in the 6-inch scale, because technically they're 2 very different figures. So I think that that's kind of really fun. So I can finally get 2 of these 501st Legion clone troopers and alongside an Anakin, so that'll be really fun. Moving down to the ankles, that was a little bit of an aside. The ankles, we can see the sculpting here on the boots is plain white. We don't have any weathering on the boots, which again, considering the weathering on the rest of the figure, might be a little bit odd. I noticed that Hasbro doesn't often do that, so perhaps they look a little bit odd being this clean. We can see the sculpting there of the strap around the ankles. We can see the underside with the peg holes there. Now, the ankles sometimes on these older figures, like the hips, can be quite stiff. Thankfully, this one seems to be okay, but it's very clicky. It's kind of hitting those points, and I can sort of hear the clicking as it's sort of making those movements. Now, the armor does come back quite a fair bit in the back, of course, following the on-screen appearance, which is going to be completely limiting with pointing the toe down very much, because that is completely locked up there. So most of the movement here is towards sort of the front. Slightly awkward angle, but at least it does give us that sort of ability to adjust the ankles to make sure, because sometimes you just need those little bit of moments there just to kind of tweak a figure to make sure that they stand upright. And now I've kind of bent this one all over the place. I'm definitely going to need a little bit of adjustment to get him standing upright. I did notice he was pretty good about standing straight right out of the box. Sometimes the legs on certain figures, you really do need to spend a bit of time working with the articulation to get them to stand up straight out of the packaging, which is always a little bit concerning, but he was nice and straight. You can see I've got his hands kind of looking like he's missing something. So let's take a closer look at the blaster accessory. So for the clone troopers, this is the DC-15 blaster carbine. The naming is kind of a little bit confusing. It's very similar to the longer clone trooper rifle, also known as the DC-15 blaster rifle. But yeah, I'll call this one the blaster carbine. So the packaging on mine, the plastic tray that this was in, seemed to have put a little bit of pressure on this one because it's got just an ever so slight curve to it. I know that there are tips and tricks, you know, putting them in hot water and stuff to kind of straighten these ones out. For my one, it's not too bad. The detail is really nice. It feels quite sort of sharp, which I often take to be sort of an indicator of sort of the fine points of detail. It's really hard to show, but these little bits here, they've got the tiny little detail points on them, which is really quite nice. And yeah, we've got an enclosed trigger guard. It looks like this is sculpted from that kind of speckly, slightly metallic plastic. I don't believe this is painted, but it's got just that very subtle speckle to it, where it's kind of looking like sort of like a gunmetal, not a true shiny, sort of that almost chrome silver, but sort of like a dark gray with a little bit of a metallic sheen to it, which is quite nice. So I'm really hoping this enclosed trigger guard is going to fit nicely in this clone trooper's fingers. So let's give it a go. He's got a really nice extended finger, so I'm hoping this is going to go in there nicely. Of course, I got to hold on to the hand because this, there, very nice. That went right in. He could hold that nicely. The finger looks good. You can see it hooking through there. So let's just spend a moment seeing if I can get him into a good two-handed pose, because of course we've got that restriction at the elbows. So quickly getting the hands into position. This is how my 501st Clone Trooper Black Series figure is holding the blaster accessory. As you can see, it's kind of quite low next to the body. When I think of the 501st Legion Clone Troopers, there is a few iconic scenes, and one of them is when they're threatening Bail Organa, it's time for you to leave. I kind of think of them sort of holding it higher up next to the chest, or sort of aiming it closer to their helmets. Certainly we see a lot of clone troopers sort of holding them closer up, higher to their chest, and it's just such a shame that for this figure, with the articulation really being restricted by that elbow band, it means that I can't raise the accessory any higher without sort of swinging the arms up higher, and it kind of just looks like he's holding it out in front of him. So in terms of posing, because I'm not trying to recreate scenes, this doesn't look too bad. You can see the curve just a little bit there with the way that it's kind of a little bit bent by the packaging, but it's not too bad, especially if I'm sort of aiming it at a different angle there. So overall, I know this is an older figure. I knew that going in, and I knew that there was pretty good odds that this one would be quite high on the list for Hasbro to remake with the modern articulation, but I still really wanted to add this to my collection. Just because a figure is older doesn't mean that I don't like it or don't want it in my collection. I would have to sort of pare back my collection by quite a lot if I was going to get rid of every figure that has a modern, improved version. So, and of course, now that there is a new one, I can have two of them, because I think these guys just look great in a group, and I don't really want to buy 6 of them. I've got too many Black Series figures on my wish list to be doubling up at this stage, but I am excited that they're making a new one, especially for the important 20th anniversary of Episode 3. I'm just so excited. I can't wait to see what more merchandise. I really hope to see sort of just some really fun throwbacks to Episode 3 that involve the 501st Clone Trooper. Of course, we saw Hasbro announce the 1:1 scale a Black Series replica helmet. I'm really hoping to add that one to my collection. I think it looks cool. It's just so iconic, and this figure looks cool. Of course, as I say, it's an older one. The articulation is limiting, but for my purposes, for adding this one to my lineup of figures, he's going to look a little bit something like this. And for that, I think he's really cool. From the front, you don't really see those pegs. I see it a little bit here because I've rotated this arm forward. This one is hidden quite to the side, and I don't see the knees at all because we've got these really nice kneecap armor pieces here that are completely sort of hiding that articulation. So for display, he works fine, and that works for me. So I think he's really fun. I just quite think the weathering on the legs just actually looks like mud. It's kind of fun. It just looks like you know, I gave this to a young fan and they played with it outside for an afternoon and had fun with it. I think it looks really cool. And of course, it's really taking me back to those early days of my Star Wars collecting journey in the prequel era. I was absolutely so hyped for Episode 3. I love that era of Star Wars and my collecting journey. So this was a little bit of a nostalgic trip down memory lane. Of course, the Black Series line didn't exist back then, but I like to think that I would have grabbed this on those sort of midnight toy releases back in 2005. He just looks really cool. It makes me want to go back and watch Episode 3 after I've opened up this figure, because those were such incredible scenes to see for the first time in the theater, and it's taking me right back to that time. And of course, that is what a lot of collecting for me is. It's, you know, reminding me of those awesome moments in the Star Wars movies and series that I just want to celebrate with collectibles that I can look at every day. So there you go. The older figure, but still a lot of fun. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today as I opened up another Star Wars Black Series archive figure and had a lot of fun checking out the details. I think he looks awesome. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the galaxy, and let's hang out again very soon for more Star Wars fun. May the Force be with you. If you're a Black Series fan, I recently unboxed the archive Clone Commander Cody figure. That video is linked here in case you haven't already seen it, as well as a whole Black Series unboxing playlist. This is the way.